Yes,
wonderful.
go ahead.
I think the choice of putting me at the end was very intentional because what we've gone in this wonderful series of talks, and I took notes on everyone, was to go from the large macro view, and I am actually giving you the micro view, not of things, but of our human brain. Um, my work is from UCLA. As I said earlier, we missed Marcelo Suarez Orozco so much. But I will be speaking in a very particular way about how literacy is a form of knowledge that we can look at the changes that have been wrought by digital media in very particular ways. And I begin with Walter Ong, who has been such an influence on many of us, who said that technologies are not mere external aids, but also interior transformations of consciousness, and never more important than when they affect the word, that source of information. But I'm going to be suggesting to you that reading is like what Vonnegut said, that art is a canary in the minds. It tells us, it warns us about what are the toxins. Well, reading, literacy, how we read is like the canary in our mind, in our brain. Because when we acquire literacy, we are changing the brain, which changes the individual, which changes the society, and which I want to suggest to you is changing the future of our species, how we absorb information, how we change information to knowledge, and if we change knowledge into wisdom, how can we look at that through the study of literacy and how it's changed in a digital culture? And so it's going to be a talk in which we look at two contradicting truths. And for those of you who know the work of Nicholas Cusa, you know that one of the most important things this philosopher gave us was that when we have a coincidence of opposite believable truths, we have various ways of, of, of not just absorbing two truths, but dealing with them and coming to some kind of resolution. And so my talk is really going to be looking at the contradictions of what is occurring when the brain is learning to absorb information through different medias. But I'm also going to be informed not only by Nicholas of Cusa, who said that one of the best ways of approaching when we are dealing with such contradictions is to take a stance of learned ignorance. Now, that is a way of looking at things that I think in modern day terms can be connected not only to Romano Guardini, who influenced our Pope Francis, but Pope Francis's message, which will begin and end this talk with the thought of how can we reconcile? We are not going to go backwards. We must go forward, but how can we do that? And I am going to, in this brief moment with you, suggest that knowing about the plasticity of our human brain actually can provide us with a possible more hopeful transition as a species. And I'm thinking, as I said, even before we all came together, of what Thomas Aquinas in the Chancellor's essay called studiousness. I'm going to be talking about the virtue of knowledge, of knowing. Each person who spoke in this panel is talking about a particular perspective on knowing. And what I want to give in a few minutes is the concept that our brain is being rearranged. Not only is society being rearranged, but at a very micro level, our brain is rearranged because the essence of the brain, the plasticity, allows us to have circuits, a different form of networks, if you will. But these networks are rearranged according to how we take in information. So every language that all of you are speaking actually has a slightly different circuitry. But the writing system is not the only thing that changes. The medium itself will change the circuitry of the brain. And I'm going to just only very quickly talk about how the digital reading brain works now and then later. But I want to suggest that what it is doing that is it is a virtuous thing is that it allows us to, in essence, it facilitates our absorption of massive information. We can do that with speed and efficiency. It allows us and there are pros and cons on this, in essence, to be able to handle multitasking and interactive communication. And as some of you know, I have worked in Africa and India on the promise of technology for those children who have no schools, no teachers. And so in terms of access, in terms of changing some of the inequities for our poor and disenfranchised peoples, the dissemination of knowledge through digital media has offered us a promise for enhancing human development. I say this first because I am now going to move into what I am most worried about. But I say it within a context that Sherry Turkle described. We cannot think in binaries. We transgress, says Sherry Turkle, not because we're building the new, whether it's the Internet of Things or all the various platforms that have not even been invented, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what is disrupted or diminished by a particular medium. And like my colleague at UCLA, Patricia Greenfield, there are costs and weaknesses to how we use different mediums. But the cost in the digital use of information for the human brain appears to be a threat to deeper time-consuming processes. Now, I want to, in just 5 minutes, introduce you to the concept of deep reading. Because when we read, we are using some of the most extraordinary processes of the human brain. One of the speakers talked about McLuhan's use of analogy. When we read any text, we are connecting it by our analogical thinking to what we already know. So what we know is important for the new text or information we're getting. From that, we are using, if you will, not only inference and deduction, but we're also using something really important, and this also was in our chancellor's essay. We are using empathy and perspective taking when we are using those deep reading processes. We are leaving ourselves, our ego behind to look into the thoughts and feelings of others. And this is the theologian, my former teacher at Notre Dame, Father John Dunn, used the term passing over. Passing over in the deep reading sense is a moral laboratory for compassion. And I somewhat facetiously said that during COVID, I felt a lot like Julian of Norwich. But one of the things that she said, which is so important, is that compassion protects, increases our sensitivities, gives life, and heals. And so compassion, empathy, is one of those deep reading processes that requires time. But the other very important aspect of what we do when we take in information and make inferences and bring other perspectives is that gives us the basis for critical analysis. It's like a frontal lobe dance. We are generating hypotheses about the truth value, or we are refuting it. This takes precious milliseconds. This is the evaluative component that is going missing when we are involved in the kind of skimming of massive pieces of information. Our sensitivities to beauty, our perception of beauty, our understanding of other viewpoints, all of this is being threatened when we have massive information that tends paradoxically to send us into silos. And some of our speakers talked about the use of the very divergent media, like Fox News or MSNBC in the United States. It doesn't matter what country we're talking about. We have people who are, in fact, going to their familiar silos of information, and that is, in essence, giving them a confirmatory reflex, a confirmatory bias, which closes, narrows the mind's ability to take in alternative perspectives. Now, what I have just sketched to you in 3 minutes is some of the most important critical empathic processes the brain uses. But those are the penultimate, not the ultimate function of reading at its best and what we hope to preserve. Again, my father Dunn said something so important about what contemplation gives us. Contemplation is like our own platform for wisdom. And wisdom is a conjoining of knowledge, of knowing and loving. And he compared it to Polanyi's critical lucidity being connected, critical thinking being connected to an intense moral conscience. And I do this for Chancellor Marcellus because he has said Thomas Aquinas is his hero. And so I made Thomas Aquinas's, if you will, brain as an example of what happens in the contemplative function. We are literally activating all 5 layers of our brain, all 4, our 2 lobes, all of these areas are being activated in the contemplative function. It's what Proust said when he said, at the heart of reading is when we leave the wisdom of the author behind to discover our own. My work is to connect our evolving knowledge from the cognitive neuroscience with this moral imagination. So it's like both Nicholas of Cusa and Pope Francis's concept of learned ignorance and reconciling thinking. But I want to give you if you will, 5 minutes of the evidence of these changes that are happening that we need to be aware of. When we look at infants to 5 years, we are seeing changes in the executive function. We're seeing changes in the language development of those children who are overexposed to digital screens from early on. And my colleague neurologist John Hutton and others, Tzipi Horowitz from Israel, they're looking at what happens when you look at parents who are giving the story through their reading of the story to the child versus the child just listening versus an audio plus visual animated internet iPad version. And what you see is that the brain is so much more activated. And we talked about passive versus active. That child at 3 and 4 years old is activating far more language regions when there's an interaction with the human, and it's activating less with more exposure. If we go up a few years between 5, 11, 14, we see changes in the attention of children. Attention is becoming so continuously partial. They are so distracted that they are learning less how to focus and concentrate. And so there are a lot of databases on how our children are so moving from even one medium to the next, that it's like these, and one of the researchers called dopamine lollipops. They are moving so fast, but they are not attending. And that makes changes in the connectivity in the white matter with overuse of the screen. Now, if we look at the next developmental stage, we look at young adults. And this is a story that people need to understand. Over the last 20 years, all of these data on what we're like when we comprehend on a screen the same material versus in print, what we see in a meta-analysis by Delgado and Salmeron, is that our comprehension as young adults is better when we are using print. And then if you do a sub-analysis and look at only at the digital natives, you see they are even comprehending better on print than screen. And when asked why, they say, well, we think we're better on the screen because we're faster. And here we come to a very important point about how the brain processes. The precious milliseconds I talked about with deep reading are not happening when we look at some of our students. And here's some data about not just young adults, but us. What we are doing is that we are skimming browsing. We often use an F or a Z pattern. So we go zzz, 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 which means we are word spotting our way through what we think is the most important content. And in the process, we are not getting all the details. We are less concentrated, and we are in danger, and this is my warning, of becoming, in this sense of our siloed people, less able. We are giving less time in milliseconds to understand the complexity of the message of the text. We are giving less time to understand others' viewpoint, leading to less empathic, if you will, development in not only children, but its maintenance in adults. All of which leads us to be more susceptible to false information. We're not making that frontal dance to generate and or refute the news, the fake news, which leads us to vulnerability to false fears and false hopes by demagogues around the world, leading us to have threats to our own democracy. And I use Umberto Eco and Cardinal, their beautiful quote about how delicate a game democracy is, because it provides for a dialectic of opinions and beliefs in the hope that such exchange will expand the collective moral conscious that is the basis for orderly cohabitation. And this actually connects us back all the way to Aristotle, who in his thinking thousands of years before us said that a good society has to have three lives: one of activity and knowledge, one of entertainment, and of course the Greeks used the term leisure as the basis of culture. That comes from Joseph Pieper. But the third life was the life of contemplation. And what I suggest to you is that that's the same with us as readers, as absorbers of information. We are awash in the life of if you will, information and productivity. We're awash in the use of information as entertainment, but we are lacking the life, the contemplative function of the good reader. And that affects us all. And I'm suggesting to you that reading at its deepest level is an act of contemplation, is an antidote to the susceptibility to false anything. It's an act of resistance in a landscape of distraction, and it helps bring us to thinking about time in new ways. And I'm going to end with three more slides. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum said, "It would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. The importance of others is essential for society." Now, I am, if you will, yesterday was Mother's Day, thus the roses. I am a mother of all children, and that's what we who do research on children are. We can't go back. We can't go to the past, but neither can we lurch forward without knowing in the studiousness of Thomas Aquinas what is gained, what is lost with different mediums. And so in my last book, Reader Come Home, the reading brain in a digital culture, and it's in Italian, it's in French, it's in German. But I give a developmental proposal for what I call a deep reading brains development that begins with parallel tracks, with the children the first 10 years really being largely exposed to reading in print, and at the same time, at the very same time, having a parallel development of the digital skills, with the hope that at the end we will be able to transfer our knowledge of deep reading and digital wisdom to our children through the ways we teach in new ways. And Marilyn Robinson said that the most important thing this moment in the preservation of wisdom and decency is that we learn to think and teach broadly and deeply. So our charge, my charge, is to help develop a biliterate brain capable of knowing when to skim and how to read deeply across mediums, and to design digital learning that redresses the very weaknesses the entire panel is talking about, and that helps us propel empathy, critical thinking, and reflection. And as I said, I want to end with our beloved Pope Francis. A crisis reveals what is in our hearts was an op-ed he had in the New York Times in 2020. Where the danger is, also grows the saving power. That's from Hölderlin's Hyperion. And here's what Pope Francis said after that. That's the genius in the human story. There's always a way to escape destruction. Where humankind has to act is precisely there in the threat itself. That is where the door opens. And that's what our panel is doing, bringing knowing, a moral conscience to the door, the hinge moment we're all in. Thank you so much.